Hello everyone, thanks for being here. I think we could start, we're a bit late, sorry. So my name is Karine Bigan. I'm a lecturer in Irish Studies and I'm based in Aix-en-Provence in France. In recent years, my research has focused on cultural heritage in museums and more particularly on the representation of conflict in exhibitions in Northern Ireland. And so this is how I got to meet all the fabulous people we have here on the panel today, and I'm very privileged to chair this panel. So first of all, I'm going to speak a little bit about why we decided to have this session, mostly because the theme of the conference, dissent, was inspiring for us for several reasons. First of all, none of the exhibitions that we're going to talk about today belong to the official museum sector, in the sense that none of them are shown in an accredited museum. So we're not MA members, we really shouldn't be here, and that's probably why we came. We're very grateful to the conference organizers for selecting our panel and allowing us to tell our stories, to have our stories heard in this huge auditorium. Another reason tying in with the idea of dissent is that all three projects are all community-led and give various perspectives on the recent conflict here. They're not about putting forward an agreed narrative of the conflict, but rather about speaking out on behalf of the people they represent who were directly or indirectly affected by or involved in the conflict. Doing so, and also because all three projects engage in cross-community work, they play into the current debate about the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland, where there is no agreed narrative, but rather a multitude of competing perspectives that need to coexist respectfully if peace in Northern Ireland is to be sustained. A few of our objectives for this session, based on the experience of the three projects, we are going to broach on several topics, including how do you set up an exhibition outside the museum sector with little or no professional training or guidance? How do you pitch a narrative of the conflict in Northern Ireland for different audiences, different types of visitors, local ones, international ones? How have the projects tied in or not with the museum sector and the local fast-growing tourism industry around here? And what role have the projects had as social agents, facilitators in post-conflict Northern Ireland, especially in the current political stalemate about legacy issues? I'm going to quickly introduce the three speakers today. Our first speaker would be Julianne Campbell, who's an education officer at the Museum of Free Derry. The museum is run by the Bloody Sunday Trust, which was set up in 1996. It's a community-based organization, and its aim is to assist the Bloody Sunday families in their quest for truth and justice, and also to create a proper legacy for Bloody Sunday in the civil rights era. The museum first opened in 2007, and it was totally refurbished last year. Of the three projects discussed today, it is certainly the one with the highest visibility, which hasn't been without its challenges, including for the relation between the museum and the community it represents. So Julianne will tell you about the creation of the museum, the specificity of its collection, and the challenges that they have met. Then we'll hear William Mitchell, who's director at the ACT initiative, Action for Community Transformation, which is an association based on the Shankill Road in Belfast, whose remit is to help former UVF combatants reintegrate civilian life, thereby contributing to conflict transformation and consolidating the peace. This may sound quite remote from the world of museums, but the organization has put together an exhibition about the story of the UVF from the 1910s to 1998, as well as the transition period that followed. So just like the Museum of Free Derry, the exhibition there includes artifacts and testimonies from people who were directly involved in the conflict, and William will tell you why they felt the need to reflect on their story and put it out there. Finally, we'll hear Kate Turner, who's director of Healing Through Remembering, an inclusive organization that brings people together from various backgrounds to reflect about possible mechanisms and realizable options for addressing the legacy of conflict in Northern Ireland. As part of HTR's reflection and as a trigger for discussion, about dealing with the past, HTR put together an exhibition in 2012 called Everyday Objects Transformed by the Conflict. It was meant to be touring Northern Ireland and the border counties for 6 months, which it did, but in fact it's been going on for 6 years. And it's still touring. It has been shown under various forms in various venues and locations on the island of Ireland and abroad. And Kate will tell you about the specificities of the exhibition and the lesson learnt from the project. So I pass the flicker to Julianne from the Museum of Free Derry.
Hello, my name is Julianne. I'm here on behalf of the Museum of Free Derry, one of the signature projects of the Bloody Sunday Trust here in the north of Ireland. Thank you for giving me this opportunity today. The Museum of Free Derry opened in 2007 to tell the story of what happened in the city during the period of 1968 to 72, including the Civil Rights era, Battle of the Bogside, internment, Bloody Sunday, and Operation Motorman. The story is told from the point of view of those most involved in and affected by these events, the Free Derry community, and the museum is situated in the heart of where these events took place. Phase 1 began in a once derelict housing block in Glenfadda Park, in the middle of what was the Bloody Sunday killing zone, where, on the 30th of January 1972, British paratroopers attacked civil rights marchers, leaving 13 unarmed civilians dead and a further 18 wounded, one of whom died later. The events of Bloody Sunday changed the landscape of Ireland forever. In 2005, the Bloody Sunday Trust purchased this abandoned building, the first one you can see, in Glenfadda Park, funded by Derry City Council and the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. By January 2007, Phase 1 of the museum opened with a temporary exhibition, its early success paving the way for a future state-of-the-art museum. From the beginning, the Bloody Sunday Trust felt that independence was vital in safeguarding the integrity of the story that we tell, particularly when faced with criticism from other communities and the political parties that represent them. In telling the story it does, the museum is also mindful of the community it serves, which includes many bereaved or wounded themselves, as well as those still traumatized by the Troubles. We are very aware that ours is a difficult, traumatic, and contested story, and one with potential to reopen old wounds. Through its many years of experience supporting the Bloody Sunday families, the Trust had the necessary skills, sensitivity, and experience needed to convey these collective experiences in the most honest, sensitive, and authentic way possible. While our narrative may be unpalatable to some, it represents the views and experiences of its own community. As such, the museum is widely respected for the work it does and the strong stance it takes. Over the years, our visitors have included serving and former policemen and British soldiers, loyalist ex-prisoners and ex-combatants, clergy of all denominations, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury. In recent years, the museum transformed, reopening in a state-of-the-art new premises in February last year upon the same historic site in Glenfadda Park. When the Trust embarked upon this project, the most important objective for us was ensuring the story was told properly. The original name of the Bogside History Centre changed in 2003 to the Museum of Free Derry, but the fact that we called it a museum was in some ways secondary to us at the time. We didn't really consider the specific issues or requirements of being a museum, and to us a museum was simply a term for a building that houses a historic story. But as the project developed and our collection grew, we also realised that we had taken on a very significant responsibility and one that we would have to address properly. We had an ever-growing collection of documents and artefacts that would have to be properly cared for. When we opened the first building, we called a museum. In January 2007, we still hadn't really taken on the full implications of that title. It was during that first year that we were approached during a visit by Dr. Hugh Maguire from the Heritage Council, who asked us to consider joining the Museum Standards Programme for Ireland, the MSPI. When we looked into this and at the UK Standards Programme run through the Northern Ireland Museum Council, we did see the benefit of bringing proper standards of care and documentation to our collection, and in the training opportunities this offered. We entered the Museum Standard Programme for Ireland in 2008, I believe the first Northern museum to do so, and we achieved interim accreditation in 2010. Now that we have the new building completed, we are again planning to complete this process. A fresh application for interim MSPI accreditation has just been submitted, and we plan to enter the Northern Ireland scheme in the near future. The accreditation route has been very useful for us, not just in the obvious ways. We also have been able to use it to fend off unwanted intrusion from potential funders in our editorial policy, and to show funders and others that we know what we're doing and that we're very serious about what we're doing. It's interesting to note that the story our museum tells continues to evolve, and our narrative must occasionally change to reflect this. For instance, when the museum opened, families were still awaiting the outcome of the Bloody Sunday inquiry. Derry had always known it was murder, and the museum had always reflected this. In 2010, Lord Savile's report recognised that Derry had indeed been telling the truth all these years. Lord Savile acknowledged that the British Army fired first and without provocation, and then a British Prime Minister apologised for Bloody Sunday. It was a great day of healing and reconciliation for my city. The museum's story was updated to reflect these achievements. Our loved ones have also been declared innocent, vindicated after years of suspicion as gunmen and nail bombers. This too has been reflected positively within the new exhibition space. Likewise, new inquests are added to accounts of other historic cases, and the narrative will again be adapted in coming years to reflect these and the coming decision on whether Bloody Sunday soldiers will be charged for their crimes in Derry. We're very proud of the story the museum tells, and only in recent years has this important history begun to receive the recognition it deserves. What's unique about the Museum of Free Derry is its connection to the community it serves. Theirs is a story still too recent and too raw for many to part with their personal items, and so many of our artefacts are actually on loan to us rather than donated, and they're with us for safekeeping only. This sets us apart from other museums. Donors are also given the chance of gifting items, but we find that the more personal art items and family mementos remain in the family until such a time as they or future generations might decide to gift them fully to the archive. The corduroy jacket worn by Jim Ray on Bloody Sunday is one such item. Its bullet holes plainly visible alongside a photograph of Jim sat cross-legged in peaceful protest. Also, the cinefilm camera that ran out of tape just as its owner, Willie McKinney, was shot in the back in Glenfadda Park. Both are integral to the exhibition, but remain the property of the families involved. My own family's contribution to the museum is Bishop Daly's white handkerchief on Bloody Sunday, which he waved in truce as they carried my uncle's body away from the gunfire. The bloodied handkerchief came back from the hospital with my Uncle Jackie's possessions in 1972, and it has been in our family's possession since. You can see it on the slide on its display here. My aunt kept this historic item in her handbag for decades until she was attacked and almost mugged in our street, and she almost lost the hanky forever. After this, our family agreed to give it over to the museum for safekeeping, and today it's one of our most powerful artefacts. We also invite eyewitnesses and donors to come in and talk about their personal artefacts and the story behind them, and these events have proved very popular with visitors. I feel this close connection to the families and their deeply personal stories give the Museum of Free Derry an authenticity sometimes lacking in other museums. Of course, the increased visibility of the museum since we reopened has created its own challenges. An obvious example of this is the controversy we faced last year over a certain exhibit within the new museum, namely a visual display listing all those who died in the Free Derry area between 1969 and 72, including British soldiers and RUC officers. The same list had been in the museum for a decade previously, but in displaying it differently, we drew renewed attention to its contents and attracted criticism from individuals objecting to the listing of their loved ones' names alongside security forces. This led to quite a negative and often vicious online campaign with calls to boycott the museum and a 6-day sit-in protest with the museum by 2 of the women involved. Throughout this incident, we felt it important to respect the needs of these individuals who, as bereaved relatives, had every right to their viewpoint and a right to be heard. However, their demands included the removal of names, which the Bloody Sunday Trust could not agree to. Through mediators, we worked to resolve the matter in a way that was acceptable to everyone involved. This was a lengthy and difficult process, but one that was necessary in order to address the issue fully and finally. The negotiations were successful. The museum, for its part, agreed to revise the way in which these names were displayed. We also agreed to conduct a consultation among all the Free Derry families to gauge wider views on the matter. The protesters, in turn, agreed that this would be acceptable and agreed to end their dispute. Importantly, the museum did not remove any names from the list, which preserved our integrity and credibility in keeping the museum inclusive, fair, and most importantly, historically accurate. The Trust subsequently contacted relatives of all those named in the exhibit, and the consultations vindicated our stance, with 84% of families agreeing that we keep the list of all who died, and 93% reporting that they fully supported the work of the museum and the Bloody Sunday Trust, which was very reassuring. In a museum like ours, there will always be challenges and difficulties that arise. However, we feel that by working together, most obstacles can be resolved for the benefit of everyone involved. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now hear William.
Thank you. Okay, folks, I'm not sure I want to follow Julianne by thanking the organisers for the invitation here today. I now know what the term "a rabbit caught in headlights" feels like. The last time I was in this auditorium, I sat up there in that seat to watch Paul Waller rock the auditorium. I'm not acquainted with what us four will do, but I hope your time spent here is in some way partly as meaningful. I hope you've worked out that my accent is significantly different from Julianne's, even though we're from the north of Ireland, stroke Northern Ireland. I do some public speaking occasionally, mostly in smaller groups, nothing as grand as this, but I once played a DVD of myself speaking to a group of 12 American students, and at the end of it, I asked them to write in an evaluation form what would make the experience more meaningful for them, and 6 of them said subtitles. So thankfully, the organisers today have provided that. I'm not sure if this is software or a stenograph, but if anything I say goes over there, you can blame the person typing there. I think, maybe ironic's the wrong word, but the title of this conference over a number of days, being Descent, is quite intriguing for myself, because I've never once thought of museums as being somewhere where dissonance occurs regularly. And thinking about that before coming here today, I've sort of been pitched as the dissonant in the panel, given that I'm the only male. But as a father of 3 daughters and the grandfather of 5 granddaughters, I'm quite comfortable being a dissenter when it equates to my principles of feminism. So I sit here readily bound to the greater influence of my 3 co-speakers. But before I actually talk about what I'm here to talk about today, I would just ask you to be mindful of a note of caution, especially those of you that aren't from this part of the world. I know there's quite an international audience here today. People have come from far off lands. When out in Belfast socialising over these 3 days, please do not categorise yourself as a dissonant. it takes on a new connotation, particularly here in Northern Ireland. So my own presentation has both a personal and a professional context to it, because I'm going to talk about being the curator, to use the museum parlance. I've never considered myself that, but I'm someone who has compiled a collection of things that often you might find in museums. But it's got both a personal and a professional context to it, because as Karine introduced at the start, each of us have in some way, either through the exhibits, the collections, or the artifacts, call them what you will, got some sort of personal connection to them, and I'm no different. I'm a former political prisoner who engaged in the conflict as a boy, still at school, at 15 years of age, and subsequently 2 years later found myself incarcerated in Long Kesh for the next 13 years. On release, I returned back to a community that was ravaged by conflict. North Belfast suffered 25% of all the deaths during the conflict, and I returned there to, by and large, a community that nothing was different in. The only noticeable, visible difference that I could see was that the buses were a different colour. But the root causes that kept us apart were still endemic. We lived apart, we socialised apart, we were educated apart, we were employed apart, and we worshipped apart. And in fairness, I struggled to reintegrate back into that community. And I sought to play a meaningful role in it without necessarily knowing what that was. And in 1994, with the first ceasefires, first by the Republican movement, and then quite quickly, 3 months later, by the Loyalist movement, there was at least something that was developing and being nurtured that subsequently then moved further after the Good Friday Agreement and devolved government. And with the development of projects that sought to engage those who had a role in the conflict in playing this meaningful contribution to their communities, I became, first of all, a youth worker and then a restorative justice practitioner, where I was a senior mediator with a community-based restorative justice group for 10 years. And what I'd found was I'd come full cycle back from that paramilitary activity in the past that led to my incarceration, and then subsequently engaging face-to-face with those who were still armed within the conflict. So that in 2007, when the group that you heard Karine mention, the Ulster Volunteer Force, declared what they called a statement of intent, calling on all former military personnel to desist from military activity, I, with others, developed Action for Community Transformation, a conflict transformation initiative seeking to engage those who are categorised as former combatants. And within that, as a mode of peace building, I developed what is known now as a small community-based museum. But it was a struggle actually to call it a museum, because my own experiences of museums are these bastion of places that are quite fusty. Only fuddy-duddies go to them in tweed jackets with elbow patches. Lo and behold, I have 2 of them myself. But something that resonates with me is in 2016, the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to Bob Dylan, someone whose work resonates significantly with myself. In 1966, he wrote and sang that in the museums, infinity goes up on trial. Now, to a lay person, a student of all things Dylan-esque, that particularly intrigued me in coming here today, because I think what he was inferring to, in my limited understanding of it, is that he was talking about how history over time is never ending, but should not escape the rigours of evaluation, inquisition, critique, and so on and so forth. And whilst I was hesitant to come here today and criticise the world of international museums, I was quite motivated in hearing some of the speakers, particularly on this platform this morning, when they were actually doing the opposite and they were calling for dissenting voices. I've heard on more than one occasion in the subsequent workshops I've attended where people are talking about how do we make museums more inviting to the public at large. And I consider my own personal experiences in that. Sorry, I've just noticed I got carried away there and didn't change the text. So, obviously, you'd probably expect each of the speakers maybe have done a bit of wider reading around the concept. And I just want to share two findings that I got from a global evaluation of museums at large. And the negative evaluation that emerged in general terms, particularly around guided tours at museums, was that they were too expensive. They either covered far too much material or not enough. They had no personal connection between the agent and the exhibits. There was a discomfort in asking questions from the recipients, and that the guides lacked enthusiasm that in some respects increased passivity. Now, counteract that also with any evaluation should at least consider the positive. And I want to focus on the positive before moving to the next slide, because what emerged from that evaluation was that structured narratives with rich information and formal analysis were what resonated most with visitors to these guided tour experiences, particularly around museums, on streets, in areas of conflict, and so on and so forth. And my own experience, in some way, has a juxtaposition between both, because on the one hand, the negative I can most certainly relate to, and none less than the Sistine Chapel. I found it one of the most negative experiences of my life in the significant scores of numbers of museums and tours that I've taken, because I felt like herded cattle being chaperoned around this place with no connection whatsoever to what I was coming to see. But equally so, at the opposite end of that spectrum, the most dynamic guided tour, or one of them that I ever engaged in, was free. It was in Budapest. It was a free walking tour. It was called the Communist Tour, and there was no charge with it. But it was compelling, it was full of humour, it was full of personal experiences, and so on and so forth. So in learning from that experience, when I was creating the collection that we now call Action for Community Transformation, our journey, our narrative from the Covenant to the Good Friday Agreement, I wanted to at least integrate the telling of stories, collectively known as narratives, with the visible display of collections, usually referred to as artefacts. And in doing that, what I had learnt from this global evaluation was these structured narratives with rich information and formal analysis are brought more dynamically into interaction with the agents that come to see them when artefacts bring them to life. And by that what I mean, unlike formal museums that I've visited in the past, where you're chaperoned behind often a barrier, you're not allowed to engage visibly or physically with anything that's on display. In actual fact, an art historian once told me that the average time a visitor spends in front of a piece of art in any museum the world over is 3 seconds. I did not want to have that passive experience repeated in having something that I dare say was referring to as a museum. And what I learned was when the artifacts are integral to the story and bring it to life, they become more compelling when you can actually touch them. So when you can, in some respects, enter into the universe of the telling of the experience by the narrator, by physically handling something he or she talks about, it can be more socially engaging. And this is something I wanted to attempt to create, albeit in my limited, small, community-based experience. So, what is it we have? You know, the backdrop are some of the displays there. Unlike Julianne, I didn't create a compilation of them, but they're used there as a watermark. So it's called From the Signing of the Covenant to the Signing of the Belfast Agreement. So in some respects it charts not just a political, but also a historical chronology that I would argue in the first instance is objective and quite accurate, and could not be contested by historians and others, because the first half of it, which begins with opposition to Home Rule in 1912 and weaves its way through until the outbreak of our contemporary conflict, euphemistically referred to as the Troubles in 1969, it charts all those historical periods and is brought to life with an associated range of artefacts. But I've also learnt that where do you start to begin to tell these stories? Bearing in mind the quotation from Dylan that I used, that history over time can be infinite. Because as a lay person engaging in social science, I've learnt from others that, particularly a man known as William Foote White, who in his anthropological study of peasants in Peru began creating narratives whereby he asked them to refer back to conflict within their country 50 years. And every single one of them said, no, not 50 years, 1,000 years. So where do you begin in telling this story? In this place, Northern Ireland, that can be quite contentious, because depending on your perspective, how far do you go back? So I don't ignore that these narratives can emerge and originate at a significant different period depending on the telling of the story. So I at least attempt to capture some of that and giving it a contextual experience without having any artefacts to show for it. So I go back to the plantation of Ulster in the early 1600s. Now again, depending on your perspective, that can be viewed as a different significance in history, because from a nationalist stroke Republican perspective, it is viewed as a colonisation of Ireland, but from a Unionist loyalist perspective, it may be viewed as the administration of Ireland and the removal of the chiefdoms who were quite oppressive to Irish peasants at the time. Irrespective of that, you can't ignore the telling of it, and that's where the story starts. But it comes quite quickly, identifying Anglo-Irish relations and how we have been fractured since that period, right up to then becoming politically overt with opposition to Home Rule in 1912. Because subsequent to that, what followed then was a constitutional change significantly here in Ireland forever. And we're still trying to reconcile that difference with each other. So, I'm going to be at the centre. Earlier on, some people were showing a red card when they were going over their time. So I'm going to ignore the red card. No, I'm not, sorry. I have 2 minutes left. So within this small space then, there's a multimedia approach to bringing these narratives to life through the artefacts in this community-based exhibit. Because there's things you can touch, there's things you can hear, there's things you can listen to, there's speakers who'll speak to you, there are things you can read. So it's got this, I would argue, multi-visual, dynamic, oral interaction that, in my experience, makes it more compelling. And the last thing I would say is it provides a role for this category of people. I attended a workshop this morning by 2 practitioners from the Balkans Museum Network, Ida and Melina, and all the things they said had uncanny parallels with this place. They talked about the conflict still continues, albeit in a different form. They talked about the contested notion of heritage. They talked about the interpretation of stories can actually be quite harmful when we consider that, as we have heard from Julianne, there's a massive category of victims and survivors in this place. And they also said that what the network was attempting to do was link what they were doing to peace building. And this is a version of that in a community response. Because what's often propagated, particularly in this place, in trying to reconcile our differences, we're currently going through quite a contested period where we have no government, and what is actually regressive is we have never addressed the legacy of the past. We are at odds with each other, how we actually go about doing that. And within that, what as does happen the world over in global countries coming out of civil conflict, is in engaging in some mode of transitional justice. Often what happens is people are scapegoated, distanced, and at times blamed. And in my own experience, I think that is particularly true of those categorised as former political prisoners and ex-combatants. Because societies coming out of conflict the world over seek to blame people. Now, when they come to engage in our museum, they don't come to glorify, condone, or excuse any of their actions. What they simply do is come to tell their lived experience. What I attempt to do, and I include myself in that experience, what I attempt to do is to bring it to life with the use of narratives and artefacts. And what makes it more compelling, I've learnt from the average 500 visitors a year we get. We have just compiled an evaluation of last year, 478 visitors from 24 different groups across 11 different countries visited. What we conclude with, and with which I will conclude now, is we're attempting to demonstrate potentially how we can move away from all this conflict-related stuff that people come to hear about. So the last thing people see on leaving the museum space is the development of Action for Community Transformation, which is in itself a peace-building conflict transformation initiative. And what resonates significantly and what underpins the telling of these stories is that if we don't learn from history, it has been said we run the risk of repeating it. Thank you.
Kate,
Hello.
over to you.
Thank you. Yep. Hello. Healing Through Remembering is an independent initiative based in Belfast, Northern Ireland. It is made up of a diverse membership with different political perspectives, working together on a common goal of how to deal with the legacy of the past as it relates to the conflict in and about Northern Ireland, tying in very well to the end of what William said. Healing Through Remembering works with all of society, but primarily with those who lived through the years of violent conflict. I'm going to give the background of our organisation and work, but then focus on one particular project and the lessons we can all potentially learn from it. In 2002, we carried out a public consultation and asked the question, how should people remember the events connected with the conflict in and about Northern Ireland? And in so doing, individually and collectively, contribute to the healing of the wounds of society. The public response to that consultation led us to work on 5 themes or areas of work. They are a day of reflection, storytelling or personal narrative, truth recovery and acknowledgement, commemoration, and living memorial museum. We considered each area, not how it should be done, but whether or not there might be a way to do them that helped our society, but also whether or not doing them was the better option. As a membership-led organisation, the members directed the area of work under each theme. That work was to encourage and aid discussion about what should or shouldn't be done, not to carry out the work or even create an ideal solution. I'm going to focus on the theme, obviously, of Living Memorial Museum. We combined those 3 words as we felt the best memorial to those killed and injured was a museum that informed and educated people about the conflict and about peace. So in 2007, while still discussing whether there should even be a museum, we carried out research to see what, if any, material objects existed to be put in a museum. To our amazement, we quickly found over 500,000 items. Some were in the national museums, but stored safely in their archives to avoid controversy. Some in community museums, but accessible only to small, localized communities. And some in private collections, usually accessible to no one. We created a database of these items and put it on our website. It indicates the extent and variety of objects and where they are housed. But we quickly realized this was useful for academics, but not really anyone else. We wondered if we could put on a temporary exhibition to engage more people and to make the collections more accessible. But we worried about having guns and weapons. And so this led us to ask the question, when is a brick not a brick? So a brick in an historic building is one thing, but one thrown in violence has become something else. The conflict has transformed the brick. We began thinking of other objects that had been transformed, and for us, an obvious one is the bin lid. This lid of a household rubbish or trash can was used as a communication tool before house phones, let alone mobile phones, were commonplace. By banging them on the pavement, a loud noise could be made, which told people in the area that something was happening. The army were raiding homes, a hunger striker had died. As Belfast is in a valley, the sound echoed off the hills, and we all knew the noise. So we had a name for our display, everyday objects transformed by the conflict, and we had a logo, the bin lid. So what is the Everyday Objects Transformed by Conflict exhibition? It doesn't agree on one single version of history. It is many different views and experiences of the conflict, both unique and everyday stories. These stories are told through loaned objects, and very importantly, the labels for the objects are all in the words of those who own the object. So it lets people speak for themselves. It offers a glimpse into the everyday lives and memories of individuals, and also helps visitors explore the nature, causes, and effects of the conflict. So how do we decide what's in the exhibition? We don't. We invited people to lend us their everyday object transformed by the conflict. If they thought it met that definition, it could be included, even if we didn't agree or understand. So what did people offer us? Coins with political slogans on them, platform shoe with holes in the heel to smuggle items into, I've gone too fast, and items into prison, a police torch, frequent police checkpoints transformed what should be an abnormal object into an everyday one, a comedy record, photographs, and shrapnel removed by a surgeon from within the body of a man very badly injured in an explosion. There are many different views and explanations about our conflict. We don't agree on words, not even what we call it. It was therefore important that those who lent these items wrote the labels for them in their own words. They described the conflict and the object in the way they wanted to. Neither we nor anyone else could change their words. However, when it came to how the items were displayed, that was up to us at Healing Through Remembering. No one could complain about their items being placed alongside another object that they might not like or did not agree with, the explanation on the label. They agreed to whatever display system we decided to use, and we created display cases with bases made of pallets, like the bonfires each July. As Karina said, it was designed as a travelling exhibition, but to decide where it went, we brought together everyone who had lent an item. We thought this was the easy part, But the National Museum lenders wanted the exhibition to be in buildings with temperature control and fire alarms connected directly to a fire station. The Community Museum lenders wanted the exhibition to be in places where people went to, like shopping centres and bars. So it was difficult to get agreement, but we did. And the exhibition was hosted in a range of venues: church halls, community centres, and even offices. As in all our work, we made careful ethical considerations and decisions. For example, we have no images in our material that show a scene where any person died or was seriously injured. We're not saying everyone should do this. However, as we work to encourage debate and discussion, we felt it was important that no one walk into our exhibition, pick up our materials, or visit our website and be confronted by a scene where someone they loved, cared, or knew about had been seriously hurt or even killed. So this is an explosion in a newspaper office. We also realized that there were gaps in the objects. Almost everything lent to us related to the cities and towns. There was a lack of objects that told the experience in the countryside. For that reason, we included this image of a farmer who's also a part-time soldier working on his farm, and he's being protected by his wife with a gun. This doesn't tell all the stories of the conflict in the countryside, but it does recognize that the experience was different from in the towns, and the objects don't necessarily tell that story. As I said earlier, our work is to encourage and aid discussion on what should or shouldn't, could or couldn't be done. For that reason, it was really important for us to gather feedback from the exhibition. We placed blank luggage tags at a feedback area and encouraged people to share their thoughts. Despite the difficult subject area, the feedback for the exhibition was overwhelmingly positive. Some examples of what people said are: fascinating. I'm glad I stopped by. The everyday connection makes it all more real. Thought-provoking. Wonderful to see stories from all sides coexist, with each as significant and real as the other. Very moving. Peace can only be possible when you tell a story of the other and walk in their shoes. The exhibition was planned as a temporary one for 6 months, but due to the demands of the lenders and the visitors, we've kept it going for over 6 years now. And we've also created, additionally, a display board version and a series of short films. I'm not suggesting everyone should create their own everyday objects exhibition, although we know international colleagues have done so. But I do want to share the lessons that we feel we've learned in creating and displaying this exhibition. First, the everyday is a more accessible way to engage with the difficult issues of conflict. It allows people to remember and discuss, and also to see things from another person's perspective. It also helps us all to realize that we now live in peace and that things are very different from during the years of violence. Secondly, we don't need one agreed version of events in order to discuss the past. We can create a space where a range of different narratives or voices are all shared and can be heard. Too often, the political debate says we cannot agree on the story, therefore we cannot do anything. Thirdly, sometimes things that seem risky or dangerous can work out fine. We were so worried that people would complain about other people's labels that we created a whole appeals mechanism for hearing complaints, and we've never had to use it. And fourthly, we do not need to do things the normal or the usual way. We didn't know, but museum and exhibition curators told us, you decide in advance what's going in your exhibition, where it is going, and then you write the labels in one clear voice. We did none of that. We allowed people wholly to decide on the objects, the label, and gave them a say in the venues. But this unusual way of creating an exhibition has actually worked. So they're the lessons which we feel we've learned in creating this. And I hope that in sharing these, like the exhibition itself, we can encourage people within and outside the museum sector to think about how museums might help us all to deal with our conflictual past. Thank you.
Right, so we have officially 3 minutes for questions, I'm sorry. But then after this, there's a quite long coffee break of 45 minutes, so maybe we can use a little bit of that if you have questions, of course. But I can't see any. Are there questions?
There, here's one.
Oh yeah, but no, we need a mic, I think.
It's coming.
It's coming.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask if any of you think there would be a value in trying to create a shared story of the past, or if you think the model of lots of different stories that coexist is the best or the only way forward.
Well, I'll go with that first. I think it's fair to say we don't share anything in this place, is the short answer. But I'm reluctant, you know, of course we do share some things. We share a physical space, not very well. But we can't agree on those things that have separated us historically. And the last thing in a society divided that they're going to agree on is a narrative about why we're divided. Take, for example, this notion of trying to address the legacy of the past. So we can't even agree on a legal definition of a victim, even though it's enshrined in legislation. And because of that, we have an entire swathe of victims and survivors that are being denied pension rights for horrific injuries, some of whom were inflicted decades ago, because we can't agree on it. So agreeing on a story that encapsulates some way currently now how we are with each other is, quite frankly, a bridge too far.
I would think that we can all work together and we all share common themes and common bonds, but I would say that individual community museums would be more powerful, because then you're keeping to your own voice and telling your own story and reclaiming your own history. And I think there's power in that. There's power for the communities involved and the people involved. But as long as there's a wider network of everyone generally cooperating together, which is what's happening, you know, those barriers have already been broken down and it's a different place, but we still have our individual identities and we're fiercely proud of that. So I think that's the way it should go.
I think it's important it's not where we start, and we have no way of getting to a shared version of what happened when too many of us feel we haven't been heard. So we need to create a space where people are heard, where they're in control of their own narrative, and where we build trust. But I don't want to give up the idea that we can at some point get to somewhere where we can have an agreed narrative, but we've had 30 years of conflict. This is a generational thing that we need to work through, and we have too many needs in the meantime, as these guys have said.
The idea of one Troubles museum, I think, would be fraught with difficulty anyway. Mm-hmm. You know, you would have a different room for every different aspect of it. It would be the biggest museum in the world. So
that's an idea. Any other questions? Yes. Hang on.
Do you believe it would be a good idea to signpost to each other's museums? I don't just mean the three of you, but to all the museums, so that people, especially people from outside the province, can get the experience of a number of different narratives?
Well, as the Museum of Free Derry, we tell a very, very individual story of the Bogside community, but we work in partnership with the Apprentice Boys of Derry, which is the main unionist group in the town, and they're two very, very different histories, but we work together in a schools project, and it's been successful for years, and people are always surprised when they hear that we work together, but we do. And again, it's not easy at times, but it's also necessary and important. So I think that's slowly happening.
Yes, I would concur with that. I've actually been to the Museum of Free Derry on 3 separate occasions. Once personally, and 2 other times in a working capacity, and I took 2 groups to. I've also seen the Healing Through Remembering exhibition on more than one occasion. So we don't disassociate ourselves from each other in telling these narratives. In actual fact, I go as far as to say, particularly in relation to the last question also, the multiplicity of having the richness of multiple narratives is what makes them equally meaningful. I know the people of Derry, their story takes precedent to them, but it doesn't to other people, and equally so, the narratives that some of the people that come to my place tell should not have precedent over anyone else's. So this collaboration in some way, I think, should be not ignoring that there is a multiplicity to a lot of these different narratives and artifacts that, you know, in some occasions are stuck up in some people's loft or below their bed.
And that was part of where our exhibition started, because when we found these different collections, we brought a group of people from our organisation who came from these different backgrounds, and we visited the collections, and we realised that most of us could not, either physically or we couldn't find our way to the collections, and that was where the idea of the temporary exhibition came from. So they indicate where the items come from. We've items on loan from both these guys at the minute, and it is about saying there are all these places. The Everyday Objects exhibition isn't it, but it's borrowed from individuals and from collections, so that people can see those collections sitting placed together and go out and find them themselves.
So I would say that there's a shared mutual respect maybe among people here, and there's a healthy working respect too, and that is going to reap its own rewards.
Yes, there's a question there at the front.
You started off by saying that you weren't part of the official museum world. Could I ask you what your relationship is then with the official museum sector, and whether you think you've got something to say to traditional museums that they're missing out on, or there's things that you learn from the way they do things?
Well, I would say the activation of museum space has no relationship in any shape or form with a formal museum industry. And you've just given me cause to reflect on it, particularly from what I've experienced here today. And in truth, without sounding too derogatory, I wouldn't want to be either. I don't mean to be disparaging with that comment, but for example, I hear Julianne talking about accreditation. I explored what being part of a formal museum industry might entail, and when I seen the 72-page application form, you could quickly work out what I did with it. Because, you know, there's a certain amount of freedom in a community-based collection, such as the one I've described, that's not afforded what I have visited in the museum. You know, I've heard from Paddy this morning about, the presentation of the Troubles still being a living piece of work, and so it should be. Because in its origin a number of years ago, it was this clinical, sanitised version of things that people were left to their own devices to interpret. Now, don't get me wrong, I fully subscribe to making your own mind up about things, but if you're only reading a succinct, clinical, descriptive rather than analytical version of something, then you can go away with quite a superficial understanding of it. So what I think our space attempts to do is to, as I said earlier, bring some of that formal analysis to it. Not that people should swallow it and take it away, and that's the only truth, but rather, as we've been challenged earlier, be provocative about how you engage with it. So when people come to our space, they don't simply walk around, see it, read it, hear it, touch it, and leave. We conclude with an hour-long interaction about some of those things that they have engaged in. Now, in fairness, I don't see that anywhere else in this country, and I've visited a number of spaces. Like, for example, the former Maze Long Cache site, I visited on 2 separate occasions. The tour guide started both of the tours with the same comment: if there are any ex-prisoners in the group, please keep your comments to yourself. I have visited the Crumlin Road Gaol on, well, I've lost count. In fact, it's quite ironic. For my 55th birthday, my wife bought me a tour of it. I don't know what she was trying to suggest, but one of the places you go to is a cell I was in for 6 months. But in Crumlin Road Gaol, the tour guide actually, and this is a wee bit hard to get your head around, stays clear of the political dimension to it. It's introduced in a throwaway comment, such as, for example, in this wing, we once had political prisoners. Now, come on, I'll show you the hangman cell. So there is no interaction with what that story is. And, I was going to say unfortunately, but the tourist industry is so vital to Northern Ireland, particularly the so-called black industry, or conflict-related industry, as it's now become a cottage industry. People go to Crumlin Road Jail, I believe, to hear about those experiences, because as outsiders, it's what they hear. They don't want to hear that this is simply a Victorian gaol like 50 others throughout the length and breadth of UK. They want to hear those dynamic narratives that made this place so synonymous. So I'm not sure how much, if at all, that answers your question, but as it is, I'd like to have some of the funding and the resources that the formal museum avail of, but if it comes with being usurped or controlled or vetted in some way, keep it.
And I would say, while we're the Museum of Free Derry is actively seeking accreditation now, we're also very, very independent in the story that we tell, and we couldn't have that curtailed by anyone, so we can't have anyone dictating our editorial choices to us, and that would be, this is our history, the way we tell it, and maybe that's, although we want to be in the museum sector, we also are fiercely protective of the story we tell, and it's a living history, same as William says. The museums here that we're talking about are living history, because the people involved in them are still there, running the museums, telling their story on a day-to-day basis, and that's a very finite resource that we're not going to have forever. So I think that again sets us apart, and it's a challenge for the museum sector maybe to, how to work with museums like ours.
I know a couple of them are in the room, and I want to say that we have a good relationship with the official museum sector. I mean, we borrow items from them, and they trust us with them. But we also like to be a critical friend in terms of encouraging them to be more risky than would be in their nature. And as we come from the community voluntary sector, I kind of think that's part of the community voluntary sector's job, is to is to be more risky and to encourage statutory organisations to follow when our risk works. We've also, in terms of doing that audit in 2007, challenged the museums sector in terms of saying, look, you say you're protecting the heritage and everything, but actually, in terms of the material, you have very little of it. Most of it is out there with individuals who've set up community or personal museums and don't even know what acid-free tissue paper is, which I didn't when we started this. And how do we all help them to make sure that continues, that it is about us all having our role and working together?
Okay, well, we'll just take one final question there. And then I don't want to keep you away from your coffee for too long.
It's not a question.
Okay,
It's
good.
really saying that the three of those inputs have been really excellent. And I think small is beautiful. And also I think they're coming from organically from the community. And I'm a community development worker in the south. And I think it's really important that the stories get told from the inside out rather than the outside in. And that we do, it's really important to honour, as you have honoured all the stories of the particular struggles. And I just think the struggle itself has brought such creativity through the three pieces there. I don't automatically think working with a museum is a bad thing, but I'll be talking about it upstairs later on. But I do think it's really important that you're equal in what you were saying there about free Derry. So I think different experiences and just congratulations, fantastic.
Thank you. I think we'll finish on that note. So thank you, and sorry for taking over a little bit more of your time. And thanks to our speakers.